The house at Black Hollow. The road to Black Hollow twisted through the gnarled woods, swallowed by shadows long before dusk. Thomas Greaves, a man of weary composure and haunted eyes, clutched the letter in his coat pocket. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink barely legible, but its message was clear. He was the sole heir to the estate of his estranged uncle, Alastair Greaves, presumed dead for over a decade. The carriage lurched as it approached the manor, an enormous Gothic structure perched on a cliff's edge. Its windows were empty sockets, dark and lifeless. The air smelled of damp stone and decay. Thomas stepped onto the cracked pathway, the wind whispering through the overgrown hedges like voices from the past. Inside, the house was worse than he imagined. Dust and neglect coated everything like a funeral shroud. The great hall, with its high ceilings and monstrous chandelier, seemed to watch him. At the base of the grand staircase stood a massive portrait of Alastair, his gaunt face locked in an expression of cruel amusement. The eyes, painted with unnerving realism, followed Thomas as he moved. That night, as he lay in a canopied bed draped in rotting velvet, the house groaned like a living thing. He awoke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Heavy. Measured. Not the skittering of rats or the settling of old wood, these were deliberate, purposeful steps. Thomas lit a candle and stepped into the hall. The cold gnawed at his skin as he followed the sound. It led him downward, past the ruined parlor, past doors that had not been opened in decades, until he reached the basement. The door swung open with a breath of stale air. The steps descended into a vast underground chamber, where stone walls gleamed with moisture. In the center stood an ornate mirror, its gilded frame untouched by time. As he stepped closer, his own reflection wavered and then disappeared entirely. Instead, he saw Alastair. Not as he had last seen him in the portrait, but standing, whole and breathing, on the other side of the glass. His uncle's lips curled into a smirk. "You've come home at last," Alastair said, his voice echoing in Thomas's mind. "But the house was never yours to claim. It belongs to the Hollow. And now, so do you." The candle flickered violently, then extinguished. The darkness swelled, swallowing Thomas whole. The last thing he felt was the glass, cold and unyielding, closing around him, pulling him into the world beyond the mirror. By morning, the house at Black Hollow had a new portrait hanging in the great hall. A man with haunted eyes, locked forever behind the painted glass, watching, waiting, for the next heir to come home. The town of Black Hollow had long whispered of the cursed estate on the cliff, though few dared speak of it openly. The villagers avoided the winding path that led to the manor, muttering prayers whenever a raven took flight in its direction. But some curiosities could not be quelled. Jonathan Marlowe, a historian from London, had spent years collecting folktales of forgotten places. When news of the Greaves estate's inheritance reached him, he saw not tragedy, but opportunity. He arrived in Black Hollow weeks later, notebook in hand, determined to uncover the manor's secrets. The villagers were tight-lipped, but a few words slipped through. Cursed bloodline. A house that devours. No one ever truly leaves. Undeterred, Jonathan made his way to the estate just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. The manor loomed before him, its silhouette a jagged wound against the twilight sky. He stepped inside. Dust swirled in his wake. The air was thick with silence, pressing in from all sides. Then, as he ventured deeper, his gaze fell upon the portrait at the base of the staircase. A man with haunted eyes. His features familiar. Thomas Greaves. The candlelight flickered. A whisper rustled through the empty halls. "You've come home at last." Jonathan shuddered, the cold seeping into his bones. He turned sharply, certain he had heard movement in the parlor beyond. Cautiously, he stepped inside. The room was suffocatingly dark, save for the glow of moonlight streaming through the fractured glass of a high window. Something shifted. A shadow detached itself from the corner, long fingers curling around the frame of a dust-laden chair. "You seek answers," a voice rasped, barely more than a breath. "But knowledge has a cost." Jonathan swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The figure emerged, draped in the remnants of tattered finery. His gaunt face was eerily familiar. "Thomas Greaves," Jonathan whispered, his breath catching. The specter's lips barely moved. "You must leave." "The house," he faltered, eyes darting toward the mirror standing tall in the corner of the room. "It sees you now." Jonathan turned to the mirror, its surface rippling as though disturbed by unseen hands. A distorted reflection stared back at him, features warping, stretching, until they were no longer his own. The air in the room thickened. The floor beneath him trembled. From somewhere deep within the house came a low, guttural groan. Jonathan took a step back. The portrait in the hall had changed. A second figure now stood beside Thomas Greaves. The house at Black Hollow. The night was thick with fog when Jonathan Mercer first laid eyes on Black Hollow House. Its silhouette loomed against the moonlit sky, a skeletal ruin of crumbling stone and twisted ironwork. The carriage creaked to a halt before the rusted gate, and the driver, a weathered old man with deep-set eyes, refused to go any further. "This is where I leave you, sir," he said, his voice laced with unease. "I'd turn back if I were you. That house ain't meant for the living." Jonathan scoffed, tightening his coat against the autumn chill. He had traveled too far to be dissuaded by superstition. The house belonged to him now, a long-forgotten inheritance from an estranged great-uncle. He had come to claim what was rightfully his. The gate groaned open under his touch, and as he stepped onto the overgrown path, a shiver ran through him. The house stood waiting, its black windows like empty eyes, watching. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and neglect. Dust coated the grand staircase, its banister carved with grotesque figures that seemed to twist and contort under the flickering light of his lantern. Shadows danced upon the walls, cast by a chandelier that swayed gently, though no wind stirred. Jonathan explored the house, his footsteps echoing through vast, abandoned corridors. The furniture remained, covered in sheets like spectral forms frozen in time. In the drawing room, an old grandfather clock stood silent, its hands frozen at midnight. The fireplace bore the remnants of a long-dead fire, and above it, a portrait of a man stared down at him, his own face reflected in the oil-painted eyes. His great-uncle, Ambrose Mercer. A strange unease gripped him. The resemblance was uncanny, as though he were staring at his own ghost. He shook off the feeling and turned away. It was only a painting, nothing more. That night, the whispers began. Jonathan woke to the sound of soft murmurs threading through the corridors. At first, he thought it was the wind slipping through cracks in the stone, but as he listened, he discerned words. Indistinct, yet insistent. He took the lantern and stepped into the hall. The whispers ebbed and flowed like the tide, leading him toward a locked door at the end of the corridor. The key turned too easily in the rusted lock, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside was a study, untouched by time. Books lined the shelves, their spines thick with dust. An ornate desk sat in the center, papers scattered across its surface. But it was what lay beyond the desk that made Jonathan's breath hitch. A mirror, tall and cracked, its frame wrought from blackened silver. The glass was clouded, but as he stepped closer, his reflection sharpened. And then, it moved. Not a trick of the light. Not his own delayed motion. The figure in the mirror smiled. Jonathan stumbled back, his heart hammering. The reflection stepped forward, pressing its palm against the glass. It looked like him, but the eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, as though they led into an abyss. "Jonathan," it whispered, though its lips did not move. His blood turned to ice. The papers on the desk fluttered, and he grabbed one with trembling fingers. The handwriting was spidery, urgent. Asterisk, he is watching. The mirror is his prison, but not for long. I sealed him away, but he grows stronger. Do not let him out, asterisk. Signed, Ambrose Mercer. The whispers turned into laughter. The mirror began to ripple, the surface undulating like water. The reflection's hand pushed through first, its fingers clawing at the air. Jonathan lurched forward, searching for something, anything, to stop it. His hands found an iron poker near the fireplace. With all his strength, he swung. The mirror shattered, shards exploding outward like jagged teeth. A scream tore through the house, shaking the walls. The air grew thick, suffocating, as something unseen howled in rage. Then, silence. Jonathan gasped for breath, staring at the broken remains. But his relief was short-lived. From the darkness of the shattered glass, something still moved. And it was laughing. The fragments of the mirror did not simply reflect the room. They twisted and writhed, shifting like the surface of a dark lake. Jonathan took a step back, but the shadows at his feet deepened, stretching unnaturally across the floor. A whisper slithered through the air, coiling around him like unseen tendrils. You cannot break what is already part of you. Jonathan turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a force that sent tremors through the walls. The laughter grew louder, reverberating through the house. It was not just one voice now, it was many, overlapping, discordant, maddening. The shattered mirror had not destroyed whatever lurked within. It had freed it. A cold pressure settled against Jonathan's chest, as though invisible hands were pressing him down. He struggled to breathe, his vision darkening at the edges. The room spun, and then, suddenly, all fell silent once more. A single whisper remained, soft yet piercing. Welcome home, Jonathan. The Blackwood inheritance. The storm raged over the Blackwood estate, its ancient spires cutting through the howling winds like jagged teeth. Lightning clawed the sky, illuminating the grand yet decayed facade of the mansion that had stood for centuries, harboring secrets long forgotten by the living. Jonathan Harrow arrived at dusk, his carriage rattling over the gravel path leading to the entrance. The letter he had received spoke of an inheritance, a forgotten branch of the Harrow lineage, and a mansion left to him by an unknown benefactor. He had no family that he knew of, and yet, Blackwood Estate was now his. The great wooden doors groaned open as he pushed against them. The air inside was heavy with the scent of dust, damp wood, and something else, something metallic and sharp. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its balustrade carved with figures that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. Master Harrow, I presume? A voice rasped from the shadows. An elderly man, his frame wrapped in a moth-eaten coat, stepped forward. I am Rupert, the caretaker. It has been long since the halls of Blackwood have known a master. Jonathan studied the man's pallid face. How long has this place been abandoned? Rupert's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. Abandoned? Never, sir. It has merely been, waiting. That night, as Jonathan settled into the vast, cold bedroom that had once belonged to some distant ancestor, the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. The candle on his nightstand flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move with intent. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of whispered voices and spectral figures drifting through the halls. A sound jolted him awake. A whisper, no, a sigh, coming from beyond the wardrobe. He reached for the candle and stepped closer, his breath clouding in the suddenly frigid air. The wardrobe door creaked open, revealing not clothes, but a passage, a narrow, dust-laden corridor winding deep into the house's bones. Heart pounding, he stepped inside. The passage smelled of earth and decay, the walls lined with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow him. At the end of the passage was a door, its wood blackened and scarred. As he reached for the handle, a cold hand clamped over his wrist. He spun around. Rupert stood there, his eyes wide, pleading. "You must not open that door. Some doors are meant to remain shut." Jonathan wrenched free. "What is behind it?" Rupert swallowed hard. "A mistake. A sin of the Harrow bloodline. Something that should never wake." Ignoring the warning, Jonathan pushed the door open. A gust of freezing wind erupted from the darkness, carrying with it the sound of something waking, something stirring after a long, restless sleep. The room beyond was lined with mirrors, each one reflecting something different, an image not of the room, but of places and horrors beyond comprehension. And in the center stood a figure, its form shifting, writhing between the shapes of men, beasts, and things unknown. Its eyes locked onto Jonathan's, and a voice, as ancient as the stones of Blackwood itself, whispered, "You have freed me." The storm outside grew fiercer as the whispers became screams. The mansion groaned, its very foundations trembling. Rupert grabbed Jonathan's arm. "Run, Master Harrow. Run while you still can." But Jonathan stood frozen, his reflection in the mirrors no longer his own. The shadows stretched, reached for him, and the last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was his own face, twisted into a grin that was not his own.